So around the world, polls show that religion is losing its favor among younger generations. Doesn't matter if it's Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. In general, religion is less popular than it was in decades past. But religion still influences the law in many places around the world. This week, we'll examine how faith seeps into foreign policy. In the U.S., the separation of church and state is chiseled into the American collective conscience. Often cited as being one of this country's founding values, is actually totally incorrect. Nowhere is it explicitly written in the Constitution or enumerated in the Bill of Rights that religion must be decoupled from the state. It's simply implied in the First Amendment. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All the First Amendment says is the government will not force a particular religion on anyone, and that religion falls under the rights to free speech and expression. So why then is God referenced so frequently, for example, in the American Pledge of Allegiance, a number of dated laws around the country, or when politicians or SCOTUS justices are sworn in? They take their oath of office by swearing in with one hand on the Bible. Perhaps a nod to the Judeo-Christian values of the Founding Fathers. So regardless of no forced uniform religion in the United States, many laws and policies originate from these faith-based values of the elected leaders. Now, some countries, such as Iran, are loosely something of a hybrid theocracy and republic where the Ayatollah is both the religious leader and the de facto head of state. Or in the United Arab Emirates, Islam is not only the majority religion, but it's also the official one. And in China, the People's Republic is officially an atheist state, but the government officially recognizes 5 major religions. So for more on this discussion, we'll turn to Professor Mohammad Marandi. He's an expert in literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Professor, thank you for being with us. Now, taking a wide lens at global politics, how do you view the role of religion and the impacts it has on shaping different countries' policies, both foreign and domestic?
I think different countries have different experiences, and different eras also have their own experiences. Countries today have one experience, and 100 years ago, their experience is different. And there is no singular notion of religion. In fact, often when in the West they speak about separating church and state, they often conflate it, or they often say church and state alongside religion and state, as if the church is equal to all forms of religion, or at least the European church. And so many non-Westerners who are fascinated with the West, or who are very pro-West, often liberals, they repeat the same notion or the same ideas. So they would say the separation of church and state, or they'd say the same thing about their own religion. In other words, since the European experience has led many in the West to believe that the church must be separate from the state, these people automatically believe that since they are very pro-Western, since they're Orientalists themselves, they're impacted by Orientalism, they mimic Western narratives. Many non-Western elites, they mimic Western ideas and Western or predominant Western ideas. So they say the same thing about their own religion, as if the experience of the church in Europe is a universal experience, as if the experience in Europe must be the same for the rest of the world. Whereas while it's not universally accepted, I'm quite confident in Europe that the church must be separate from the state. I don't think it's universally accepted, but I don't think it's right to, even if it was correct for churches in Europe to be separate from politics, I don't think that's necessarily the experience or should be seen as what how the church should behave in Latin America, for example. It's based on the assumption that any religious entity outside of Europe, whether Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or anything else, is somehow inferior to the European brand, if I could put it that way.
The U.S., for example, claims to be somewhat of a secular state, but its culture is rooted in Christianity from the founding fathers. So oftentimes, these values are expressed in how, let's say, folks at the State Department, as an example, may view another country's cultural norms as perhaps sexist or even barbaric. And they'll issue sanctions against that country on the grounds of human rights. Is this an indirect way that religion impacts policy?
Yes, I mean, their views, whether they consider themselves to be Christian or secular, uh, uh, I think it's still the same thing. Many of these secular elites in the United States, or religious elites in the United States, or secular elites in Europe, or religious elites in Europe, their behavior towards the rest of the world is somewhat similar. Their policies directed towards the rest of the world are very similar. So usually we hear that Republicans are more religious than Democrats, but the wars that have been waged by the Democrats and the Republicans have been bipartisan for the most part. And the same in Europe. Europe has been highly secular, but they destroyed Libya, the most wealthy country in Africa, and turned it into a lawless land where slaves are traded. So whether you call it religious or secular, I think it's irrelevant. It's an immoral policy. It's an immoral behavior. It doesn't reflect the will of Europe or North America, because ordinary people are basically fed information by big business, the mass media that's controlled by powerful elites, so they really don't know what's going on beyond their borders. And the suppression of countries, for example, the Americas have been considered the backyard of the United States. So they're all Christian countries, but the United States sees them as being subordinate to U.S. government policy. So I don't think it's, I think it's, I think there's there's racism involved, there's supremacism involved, there's tribalism involved. But at the end of the day, it's a type of exceptionalism. Now, whether that exceptionalism, you link it to religion, or you link it to ethnicity, or to race, or to whatever, that is going to create this sense of superiority and hierarchy, and therefore countries will deem themselves to have exceptional rights. So when Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, speaks about Europe being a garden and the rest of the world being basically a jungle, that comes from that Eurocentric supremacism. He doesn't take into account the fact that Europe has destroyed much of the rest of the world through imperialism, through colonialism. He does not he does not want to understand. I'm sure he knows deep down the truth, but he doesn't want to understand that the minorities that have climbed over the walls of this garden are only there because Europe has destroyed their lands. They have nowhere else to go.
Now, the Chinese government, they are officially atheistic. They're not secular, they are specifically atheist, although they do officially recognize a few big world religions. How does this lack of religion in government reflect in how they create laws or develop their foreign policies?
Again, here, I think that the issue is that China, at least till now, has been focused on its own development, unlike Western countries over the past few centuries, which have looked abroad, which have looked to expand their empires. And they were rivals. Western countries went to war against each other because of these empires, because of the lands that they each wanted for themselves. But the Chinese, at least in recent history, they've been looking to develop their own country. And therefore, the rest of the world, whether the Chinese are better than the Americans or not, the experience of the rest of the world is that the Chinese have not imposed themselves on other countries. Now, Western countries would say that if they could, they would, but so far they haven't. They haven't overthrown different countries through coups. And in fact, the Chinese government has helped bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in their own land, whereas the United States, at least in the last few decades, it's basically wrecked their own middle class, not only through perpetual wars and through liberalism and liberal capitalism and failed policies, but also I think through the selfishness of individualism. The United States has sacrificed its own people, whereas the bulk of Chinese society, which was poor, is now moving towards the middle class. They have a better life. They're fed better. They have a better education. They have better healthcare than they had before. Whereas in the United States, it's the reverse. It's in Europe, it's the reverse. It's declining. I'm not saying it's non-existent, but the United States is definitely not the United States of the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1950s. So whatever the ideology in China, we see that the United States is doing more damage, or Europeans, secular or otherwise. They claim to be secular, but they're doing more damage to the rest of the world and to their own people through these policies than the Chinese. The Chinese are doing trade and business, whatever their intentions are. We don't see the sort of behavior that we've seen among Western governments, and they're building their country.
Let's turn our attention to China. As you probably know, China is expected to overtake the U.S. as the biggest economy in the 21st century. Now, Professor Mohammad Marandi is sticking around with us. Thank you so much for staying around, Professor. So, how does an atheist state such as China address a country that is based on religious law, like Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Muslim state, or Iran being an Islamic republic? It's Shia Muslim there, Shia Islam. Is it more difficult to see eye to eye because of the opposing views on religion as a matter of law?
I wouldn't say that Saudi Arabia has been promoting Sunni Islam. I would say that it's highly influenced by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and therefore the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab are key, and therefore that's why many people say they're Wahhabi. So I would consider that the ideology that was promoted, that has been promoted by Saudi Arabia for decades, to be very different from, or in significant ways different from, traditional Sunni Islam that we have seen across the Islamic world. In the case of China, in the case of China, I would say that the issue is not so much religion. I don't think religion is key here. As long as the Chinese respect the sovereignty of a country like Iran, as long as China respects the sovereignty of any other country, then I think that regardless of the religious ideology or the lack of a religious ideology, trade and business can continue. In Iran, you have people who are very secular, and you have people who are very religious. You have shop owners who are secular, you have shop owners who are religious. They do business, they do trade, you have neighbors who are religious and secular. The issue between China and Iran is that so far we haven't seen China attempting to undermine Iranian sovereignty and impose itself. More recently, we've seen Western countries make that claim about Huawei and Chinese high-tech industries. But for us who are looking from a more, let's say, a more balanced perspective, we know that the United States and Europeans, they are competing with China with regards to high-tech products.
Now, if we look back at Western history, at the Crusades that began in the 11th century, these wars were waged based on religion. Can the world escape this history, or do we still see remnants of religious wars today? Do you have any examples that might come to mind?
Well, you know that in the Crusades, the Europeans killed a very large number of native Christians. They massacred and slaughtered Christians in the areas which are now called Palestine and Lebanon and Egypt and Syria and Jordan. So it's not simply about Muslims and Christians. The Crusades were very brutal towards anyone who stood in their way. So on the one hand, they were religious, but on the other hand, they weren't just about religion. And again, even if we were to say that this was a war waged against Islam, I would argue that the problems that we see in the world today are not, as I was saying earlier, are not necessarily about religion itself. Right now, the conflict in Europe is between Christian countries. The Russians are Orthodox. NATO countries are largely Catholic and Anglican and Protestant, and some Orthodox, as in Ukraine. But the conflict is one about power and influence, and it's often racist and Orientalist in itself. The depiction of Russians, for example, and I say this because the same sort of tropes are used against our country or our part of the world. Russians have often been historically depicted as barbaric, as brutal in Western literature and Western discourse, and racist tropes are constantly used, even though they are not dark-skinned. They don't look like, many of them don't look like me or you. But we do see this war taking place, and that war is about power and influence. The United States and NATO, they expanded eastward needlessly. They imposed a coup. They supported right-wing groups. They don't want to call them Nazis anymore, but when you look at the Western media over the past few years, that's what they were speaking about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. So, and Nazis were humanists. They were not necessarily religious. They were humanists. The Nazis in the 1930s and 40s, they had great admiration for Greek civilization. They saw themselves as the inheritors of the Greek civilization, the rightful inheritors. They saw the contemporary Grecian people as degenerate. They admired music and literature and the arts, but they were Nazis, and they carried out genocide. So I don't. Again, to say that whether this is religious or non-religious, I think it's mostly about empire, power, wealth, and and domination.
Do you view religion as part of laws or policy for a country as being a good thing, or is it detrimental to its advancement?
Well, we don't have a single religion in the world, and different religions have different worldviews. And within different religions, we have different sects. And therefore, just like at the beginning when I was talking about church, when they say church and state should be separated, then they say therefore religion and state should be separated, which in a way assumes this hierarchy, this Eurocentric hierarchy, because the church in Europe shouldn't be a part of the state. Therefore, no religion should be a part of state anywhere else in the world, because if it doesn't work in Europe, obviously it doesn't work anywhere else. And that is implied that Europe is superior. Whether you're religious or secular in Europe, it's still, even the religion that you don't accept is somehow superior to all those other religions that you don't accept, if you get what I'm trying to say. So the experience of the church in Latin America, the experience of Islam in different parts of the world are different, the different sects, the different views. So different societies and communities have to make their own judgment. But what I can say is that in the case of Iran, we have a country where before the revolution, overwhelmingly, people were impoverished. Before the revolution, most of the country did not have electricity. They didn't have running water. And they didn't have they didn't have a nationwide healthcare network. And the list goes on. Now we have universal education. In the villages, they have primary healthcare services. In the country, based upon that religious ideology, despite all the sanctions, despite the wars that have been imposed upon it, it has remained independent. And even under these sanctions, it's been able to develop its high-tech industry, whether it's nanotechnology or stem cell research. Iran is a leading country in the world. And with regards to its military capabilities, I think it's now being talked about. So even though it's not, military capability is, it's a sad thing that it should be even debated in the world that we live in. We should be living in a more peaceful world. But the point that I'm trying to make is that despite all the sanctions and despite all the pressure, under this system, under the current constitution that is religious, Iran has had significant successes. And a lot of the problems that it has is based because of sanctions, because of foreign pressure, because of animosity from Western countries.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Professor Mohammad Marandi, thank you so much.